The wind came first. It always did, out here in the high country. It swept down from the ridgeline before sunrise, carrying the smell of pine resin and cold stone, bending the dry grass flat against the earth as if the land itself were bowing its head. By the time the light came, pale and thin and hesitant, the way winter light always was in this part of the world, the wind had already scraped the warmth from everything it touched. Ada Merritt stood in a small cemetery on the eastern edge of Redstone Crossing and felt that wind move straight through her. The cemetery was not large, perhaps 40 stones in all, some carved with careful letters, others nothing more than rough-cut slabs with initials scratched in by hand. A low iron fence ran along 3 sides, the 4th open to the slope of a hill that descended into the valley below. Someone had planted a cedar tree near the gate, and it had grown crooked under years of that same relentless wind, its trunk bent permanently westward as though leaning toward something it could never quite reach. Ada had been standing in front of one particular stone for a long time. She held a letter in her right hand. She had held it so many times over the past weeks that the paper had gone soft along the fold lines. The ink slightly smeared where her thumb had passed over the words again and again during the long journey west. She did not need to read it anymore. She had memorized every word, every hesitation in the handwriting, every place where the pen had pressed harder into the page, as though the writer was trying to make the words permanent through sheer force of will. The stone before her bore a name she did not recognize. That was the thing that stopped her breath. She had come here looking for her mother's grave, expecting, in some quiet and terrible corner of her heart, to find it. The letter had given her this town, this region of high grass and red rock and impossible sky. It had given her a name, Callum Shaw, and a direction, west along the main road, past the mill, until the land opened up into a wide valley. But it had not told her what to expect when she arrived. It had not prepared her for the name carved into this particular stone, or for the year of death, or for the fact that the stone was not weathered and forgotten but recently cleaned. The moss scraped away from the letters with what looked like careful, deliberate hands. The year of death on this stone was the same year her mother had disappeared from her life. Ada crouched down slowly, her traveling dress pulling tight across her knees. She reached out and pressed 2 fingers to the carved letters. The granite was cold enough to ache. She stayed like that for a moment, not praying, not crying, just touching the stone as though she could read something in the texture that the words themselves refused to tell her. Behind her, from somewhere down the hill, came the sound of hoofbeats. She did not turn right away. She had learned, somewhere in the long years of growing up without anyone to run to, that the best response to most things was stillness. Stillness gave you time to think. Stillness kept you from making a choice before you understood what you were choosing between. The hoofbeats slowed and stopped. Then came the low creak of saddle leather, the soft impact of boots meeting hard ground, and silence. Ada stood and turned. The man was tall, taller than she had expected from the letter's brief description, which had mentioned only that Callum Shaw was the owner of the largest ranch in the valley, and that he was a man of his word. He stood perhaps 15 feet away, at the open gate of the cemetery, one hand resting on the iron post. He wore a coat the color of charcoal, worn through at both elbows, and a hat that had seen better decades. His face was... She searched for the right word, and could not find one that was not too small for what she was looking at. Weathered, hollowed out by something that was not age alone. There were lines around his eyes that came not from sun, but from years of holding an expression very still, very controlled, against the pressure of something that wanted very badly to come through. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of a person who had seen a ghost. Ada held up the letter. "I'm looking for Callum Shaw," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was a small mercy. "I was told he could answer some questions for me about my mother." The man's eyes dropped to the letter. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the kind of tightening that most people would miss, but Ada had spent her entire life watching people's faces for the things they were trying not to show, and she did not miss it. "I'm Shaw," he said. His voice was low and rough, the voice of a man who spent more time in silence than in conversation. "And you'd best come down off this hill before the temperature drops any further." He turned and walked back to his horse without waiting to see if she would follow. Ada looked back at the stone one last time. Then she picked up her traveling bag from where she had set it beside the cedar tree, and she followed him down. The town of Redstone Crossing had the particular character of a place that had survived things. Its main street was wide enough for two wagons to pass each other without argument, and the buildings that lined it were solid rather than pretty, thick-walled, low-roofed, built to endure the winters that came howling down off the mountains every year without apology. There was a mill on the eastern creek, a general store that also served as the post office, a farrier's shop with a permanent smell of hot iron and burned hoof, two churches that did not speak to each other, and a saloon that both congregations pretended not to visit. The people Ada passed on the short walk from the livery stable to the edge of town watched her with the careful attention that small, isolated communities reserve for strangers. Not hostility, exactly. More like assessment. They were cataloging her. The quality of her coat, the condition of her boots, the way she carried herself, filing the information away for later use. Ada was accustomed to this. She had arrived in enough unfamiliar places over the years to know how to move through that kind of scrutiny. Chin level, pace unhurried, eyes forward but not aggressive, present but not demanding anything. Callum Shaw walked ahead of her without speaking. He led his horse by the reins, and Ada walked beside the horse's shoulder, which felt safer somehow than walking beside the man. The horse was easier to read. It had calm, dark eyes and a way of flicking one ear back toward her every few steps, acknowledging her presence without making demands of it. They passed the last building on the western end of town, and the land opened up immediately. One of those abrupt western transitions that still startled Ada even after the long weeks of travel, where settled human space simply ended and the enormous, indifferent world resumed. The road narrowed to a track between the grass. The sky above them was the pale, washed-out blue of early winter, enormous and empty and breathtaking in a way that made Ada's chest feel both expanded and compressed at the same time. She thought about the stone in the cemetery, the name that was not her mother's name, the year that matched the year of disappearance. Her hand tightened on the strap of her bag. "How far is the ranch?" she asked. "Far enough," Shaw said, which was not an answer, and which told her something about the kind of conversation this was going to be. The Shaw Ranch sat in a wide valley, cupped between two ridges of pine-covered rock, larger than she had imagined from the letter's spare description, the kind of property that had been built by someone who intended to stay. The main house was 2 stories, built of squared timber that had gone silver gray with age, with a covered porch running the full length of the front face. Several outbuildings arranged themselves at practical distances. A large barn, a smaller equipment shed, a low structure that appeared to be a smokehouse, and a bunkhouse set apart from the rest. It was not a beautiful place in any decorative sense, but it was solid in a way that spoke of long occupation, of roots driven deep. Someone had cared about this place for a long time. Ada noticed, as Callum led his horse toward the barn, that the porch railing on the left side had been repaired recently. New wood, not yet weathered to match the old. She noticed that the kitchen garden along the south wall of the house had been recently dug over, the dark earth turned up and waiting. She noticed that the window on the upper right of the house had a crack in one pane that had been filled with something clear and resinous, carefully done. Someone was maintaining this place alone, and someone was doing it with great effort. Callum came back from the barn without the horse and stood at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at her. Ada had, in the time it had taken him to tend to the animal, climbed the steps and sat down on the porch bench, her bag at her feet. She had pulled from the outer pocket of the bag a small piece of canvas and a needle and thread, and was reattaching a button that had come loose from the cuff of her coat during the journey. It was a thing she did when she needed to think. The repetitive motion of the needle steadied her. Callum looked at her hands. Something moved through his expression that she could not name. "You can't stay here," he said. Ada pulled the thread through, even and firm. "You haven't read the letter yet." "I don't need to read it. I know who sent it." "Then you know why I've come." Silence. The wind moved through the pines on the ridge above them, a sound like water over stone. Somewhere in the barn, the horse shifted its weight and the structure creaked softly. "What I know," Callum Shaw said, "is that there is nothing here that can help you." He said it the way a person says a thing they have rehearsed, not unkindly, but with the particular flatness of words chosen in advance, words meant to end a conversation rather than begin one. "I'll give you supper and a place to sleep tonight. Tomorrow I'll drive you back to town and make sure you have what you need for the return journey." Ada bit off the thread. She smoothed the button with her thumb, checking the tension of the stitching. Then she folded the scrap of canvas and tucked it back into her pocket, rethreaded the needle and pressed it back into the small leather case she carried, and looked up at him directly. "All right," she said. Callum blinked. He had been prepared for an argument. She could see that clearly. The slight squaring of his shoulders, the way his weight had shifted forward minutely in anticipation of resistance. Her agreement wrong-footed him. "All right," he repeated, as though testing whether the word meant the same thing coming back. "All right," Ada confirmed. "Supper would be appreciated, and I'll decide about the rest in the morning." She did not say she agreed to leave. She did not say she agreed to stay. She said she would decide in the morning, which was the truest thing she could say, and she said it in a tone that made it clear the decision would be hers and not his. Callum Shaw stood at the bottom of the porch steps for a moment longer. Then he turned and went inside, leaving the door open behind him in what she chose to interpret as an invitation. Ada sat on the porch bench for another full minute, her hands still in her lap, looking out at the valley. The light was failing now, the sky shifting from pale blue through shades of amber and deep orange along the western ridge. The wind had eased slightly, but had not stopped. It moved the dry grass in long, slow waves, the way it might move the surface of a lake, and for a moment, Ada could almost believe the whole valley was breathing. She picked up her bag and went inside. The kitchen was the warmest room in the house, as kitchens always were. And it was also, Ada observed quietly, the most lived in. The rest of what she had seen of the ground floor as she passed through, the front room, the hallway, had the quality of spaces that were maintained but not inhabited. Clean enough, order kept, but without the accumulated texture of daily use. The kitchen was different. Here there were real signs. A dent in the edge of the wooden table where someone had set something heavy down repeatedly over many years. A faded patch on the floor in front of the stove where boot heels had worn the boards smooth. 2 coffee cups on the shelf where another person might have kept 4 or 6, because 2 was all that was needed, and so 2 was all there were. She noticed there were 2 cups, and she noticed that Callum Shaw lived here entirely alone. He moved around the kitchen with the economic efficiency of a man who had been cooking for himself for a long time. No wasted motion, nothing demonstrative. He put a pot on the stove. He cut bread. He did not ask her whether she was hungry or what she preferred. He simply made food, and the implicit assumption was that she would eat it, and Ada found this unexpectedly respectful. She sat at the table and did not offer to help. She understood instinctively that this kitchen was not a place where he would want her to offer, not yet, not on the first evening. Instead, she set her bag down carefully against the table leg and placed the letter on the table between them, not pushing it toward him, not demanding he read it, just placing it there where he could see it. He saw it. His eyes went to it and away again quickly. The way you look at something you are trying to pretend you have not noticed. Ada looked around the kitchen while the soup heated. There was a shelf along the far wall that held a small collection of objects arranged with the unconscious care of things that matter. A tin of coffee, a jar of dried herbs, a folded piece of cloth that might have been a dish towel or might have been something else entirely. And then her eye snagged on something at the end of the shelf, half hidden behind the coffee tin. A small book. The spine was cracked and the cover worn through at the corners to show the gray board beneath. But it was the color of the cloth tie that held it closed that made Ada's hands go still in her lap. A specific, faded blue, the particular shade of a dress she could remember from the age of 5 with the absolute clarity that certain things are remembered from childhood, the important things, the things that are seared in before you know enough to choose what to keep. She had not thought about that dress in years. She told herself it was a coincidence. That faded blue was a common enough color in this part of the world where everything faded. She told herself this with some conviction, and looked away from the shelf, and directed her attention to the soup Callum set in front of her without comment. But her heart was beating differently now. Faster, more careful. She ate. He ate. Outside, the wind picked up again with the full arrival of dark, throwing itself against the walls of the house in long, gusting pushes that rattled the window glass in its frame. The lamp on the table between them burned with steady warmth. Ada watched the man across from her without appearing to watch, a skill she had refined over years of being in situations where open observation was not safe. He was not, she thought, a cold person. He was a person who had arranged himself to give that impression because cold was easier to maintain than the alternative. There was something in the way he handled the bread, tearing it rather than cutting it, in the distracted way of someone whose hands are doing a familiar thing while the mind is somewhere else entirely. that reminded her of the way grief looks when it has been lived with so long it has become ordinary. "The stone in the cemetery," Ada said. She set her spoon down. "The one I was standing at when you arrived. Do you know who it belongs to?" Callum looked up. For just a moment, before the control came back, she saw it. Something raw and old and very tired behind his eyes. "Yes," he said. He did not say anything more. He looked back down at his bowl. Ada picked her spoon up and finished her soup. The lamp burned. The wind pushed at the house, and the house held. He showed her to a room at the end of the upstairs hallway. It was a simple room. A narrow bed, a chest at the foot of it, a small table with a basin and a pitcher of cold water. The window looked west toward the ridge. Callum set the lamp he had carried up on the table, checked the wick without being asked, the act of a person accustomed to being responsible for other people's safety, and moved to the door. "There's a bar on the inside," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Use it." He said it without implication, without threat. Said it the way you say it when you mean simply that a woman in a stranger's house deserves to be able to lock her door, and that you want her to know you know this. Ada recognized the gesture for what it was. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded once and pulled the door closed behind him. She listened to his footsteps move back down the hallway and descend the stairs, even and unhurried, until the house swallowed the sound of them. Ada did not immediately reach for the bar. She stood in the center of the small room for a moment, her bag at her feet, the lamplight warm around her. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed, which gave under her weight with the soft complaint of old springs, and pressed her hands flat against her thighs. She had been traveling for a very long time, not just across the miles of open country between the east and this high-altitude valley. She had been traveling towards something since she was 6 years old, since the morning she had woken in the orphanage dormitory and understood, with the wordless, absolute comprehension of a child, that no one was coming for her. She had been moving toward an explanation for the better part of her life, and now she was in a room at the end of a hallway in the house of a man who knew something he was not saying, and the window beside her looked out over a valley so vast and still and dark it might have been the edge of the known world. She reached into her bag and found, in the interior pocket where she had placed it for safekeeping, the letter. She read it one more time by lamplight, though she knew every word. The handwriting was her mother's. She had recognized it the moment the letter arrived, though she had not seen it in more than 2 decades, because some things you do not forget. The message was short. It spoke of illness, of time running out, of things that needed to be made right before the end. It gave the name of the town. It gave the name of the man. And it said, "Find him because he is the only one who was there. And you deserve to know what really happened. And I am so sorry I could not come to you myself." Ada folded the letter and held it in both hands. Then she set it on the bedside table, stood up, crossed to the door, and slid the bar into place. She went back to the bed and lay down on top of the covers with her boots still on, the way she had learned to sleep in uncertain places, always ready. The lamplight flickered as a fresh gust of wind found some crack in the wall and breathed through it. In the distance, very faintly, she could hear the pines on the ridge moving in the dark. She did not sleep for a long time, and when she finally did, she dreamed about a dress the color of faded blue sky and small hands reaching, and the particular sensation of being lifted, of leaving the ground, and the confusion of not knowing, even in the dream, whether what was happening was rescue or loss. She woke before dawn, as she always did, and lay still in the unfamiliar dark, cataloging the sounds of the house around her, the settling of timber in the cold, the distant movement of animals in the barn, the wind, softer now but persistent, like an old argument that had never quite been resolved. Then another sound, the creak of a floorboard in the hallway. Footsteps, quiet and deliberate, moving toward the staircase. She listened to them descend. A pause. The soft, particular clunk of a lamp being lit in the kitchen below. Callum Shaw was awake before the sun. Ada lay in the dark and thought about what she had come here to find, and what she might find instead, and whether those two things were going to turn out to be the same. After a while, she got up, smoothed her dress as best she could, and went to the window. The valley below was dark still, but the ridgeline to the east held the faintest gray suggestion of approaching light. The ranch yard was still and cold, the shapes of the outbuildings just visible, and there, coming from the barn, making its way across the frozen ground toward the house, was the figure of a man carrying a pail, moving with the deliberate steadiness of someone who has made this same walk every morning of his life. Ada watched him until he disappeared around the corner of the house. Then her eye moved to the barn and stopped. The large double doors were closed, as she would expect at this hour, but there was a smaller door set into the side wall of the barn, and it was standing open, and through it she could see a lantern burning inside, hung from a post at the right height for a person to work by. But Callum had just come from the barn. She had seen him, and the lantern was not swinging, not recently moved. There was someone else in that barn. Ada stood very still at the window, her breath fogging the cold glass. The lantern light burned steadily inside the small door. A shadow moved across it, the unmistakable silhouette of a person, moving slowly, as though searching for something, or waiting. She watched for a long moment. Then she reached for her coat. Because she had not come all this way to watch from a window, the barn smelled of hay and cold leather, and the particular warmth that large animals generate even in winter, a living heat that the timber walls held long after the temperature outside had dropped below freezing. Ada stepped through the small side door and stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the lantern light. The barn was larger inside than it appeared from the house. 6 stalls ran along the left wall, 4 of them occupied, 2 draft horses, a smaller roan mare, and in the last stall, a horse that was clearly older than the others, moving slowly as it shifted its weight, its dark coat threaded through with gray at the muzzle and along the crest of its neck. On the right side of the barn, a workbench ran the full length of the wall, and above it hung the organized accumulation of a working ranch, tools arranged by size, coils of rope, spare harness pieces, a row of metal hooks holding items whose purpose Ada could not immediately identify. There was no one there. The shadow she had seen from the window was gone. The lantern burned steadily on its post, undisturbed. Ada moved forward slowly, checking each stall as she passed. The draft horses regarded her with mild interest. The roan turned its head and blew a soft breath through its nostrils. The old horse in the last stall did not turn at all. It stood facing the back wall with the patient stillness of an animal that had learned to conserve everything. Ada stood at the entrance to the last stall and looked at the horse for a long moment. On the floor beside the water bucket, she noticed something she almost missed, A small depression in the loose hay, the compressed oval shape of a person who had been sitting there recently, long enough to leave an impression. The hay was still displaced, not yet sprung back to its original position. Someone had been sitting here beside this horse, and they had heard her coming and slipped out through the main doors before she reached the stall. Ada crouched down and pressed her palm flat against the compressed hay, still faintly warm. She stood, brushed her hand against her coat, and looked at the old horse again. Up close, she could see the animal was well cared for in a way that had nothing to do with utility. Its coat, though gray with age, had been brushed recently. The kind of brushing that takes time, that is not done because a working animal needs it, but because the person doing it needs the contact. The water bucket was clean. The hay in the stall was fresh, replaced more recently than the other stalls. The nameplate on the stall door read June, hand-painted in careful letters that had been touched up at some point, the paint slightly newer in the middle of the letters than at the edges. Someone tended to this horse with particular, devoted attention. Ada reached out and laid her hand gently against the horse's neck. The animal did not startle. It simply accepted the touch with the long-suffering dignity of a creature that had weathered many things and found most of them survivable. "All right," Ada said quietly, to the horse and to the empty barn, and to whoever had just slipped out through the main doors. "All right." She went back to the house. Callum was at the stove when she came through the kitchen door. He had his back to her, and he did not turn immediately. And Ada had 3 full seconds to observe the slight tension across his shoulders before he schooled it away and looked around. "Early," he said. "So are you," she replied. She sat down at the table. He set a cup of coffee in front of her without asking if she wanted it, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he operated, not from a lack of consideration, but from a particular kind of economy. The economy of a man who had long since stopped performing hospitality and now simply practiced it. Ada wrapped both hands around the cup. The coffee was strong and very hot, and she was grateful for it. "There's someone in your barn," she said. The pause before his answer was very small. Most people would not have noticed it. "The horses need tending early." "I tended horses growing up. I know what that looks like." She looked at him over the rim of the cup. Whoever it was, they were sitting with the old horse, the gray one in the last stall. Callum turned back to the stove. He moved a pan from one burner to another with unnecessary deliberateness. Outside, the light was beginning to come properly now, the kitchen brightening by degrees as the sun cleared the eastern ridge. "That horse is older than most things on this property," he said finally. "She's particular about company." "She didn't seem to mind me." Another pause, shorter this time. "No," he said. "I don't suppose she would." He said it in a tone that suggested this meant something specific, and then, after a moment, as though he had decided the courtesy of partial honesty was overdue, he added, "I go to her sometimes in the early morning, before the work starts. She's been here a long time, and she seems to prefer company in the dark." He did not elaborate further, but Ada looked at the compressed oval she had felt in the hay, still faintly warm under her palm, and understood without needing to be told that she had found his chair. She understood that this man, alone in this house for years, had been spending his mornings sitting on the floor of a horse stall in the dark. She understood this the way she understood most things, quietly, without making a production of the understanding. "I need time," he said, setting the plate on the table. before I can tell you what I know. Ada considered this. How much time? I don't know yet. It was an honest answer. She respected honest answers, even when they were not the answers she wanted. All right, she said. She reached for her bread. Then I'll stay until you do. She stayed. The arrangement was not discussed in any formal sense. There was no negotiation, no laying out of terms. Ada simply did not leave the next morning, or the morning after that, and Callum Shaw did not repeat his suggestion that she should. They moved around each other in the house and yard with the careful attention of two people learning the dimensions of a shared space, where the other person tended to be at particular hours, which tasks each gravitated toward, how much silence was comfortable, and where it began to feel like something else. Ada worked. She worked because she was constitutionally unable to be idle, and because she understood instinctively that in a place like this, usefulness was the currency of belonging. She repaired things. It was what she knew, what her hands had been trained to since childhood. The orphanage had taught her early that mending what was broken was more valuable than almost any other skill, and she had built on that foundation until the skill was not merely utilitarian but something close to art. She could look at a piece of damaged cloth, or leather, or canvas, and understand immediately what had failed and how to restore it. She saw the structure beneath the surface. She understood tension and give, the relationship between what held and what yielded. On the second day, she asked Callum for the saddle she had noticed hanging in the equipment shed, a working saddle, not the decorative sort, but one that had been neglected long enough that the leather had begun to stiffen and crack at the stress points. He looked at her for a moment when she asked, then got it down from its hook and set it on the workbench without comment. She spent the better part of that afternoon at the bench, cleaning and conditioning the leather in stages, using the kit she had observed in the shed. Oil, a soft cloth, the particular technique of working in small circular motions to coax flexibility back into stiffened hide. It was meditative work, and she let herself be meditative, and it was in that state of quiet, focused attention that she began to really see the barn around her. She noticed the things that were there and the things that were conspicuously absent. She noticed that the workbench was organized with a precision that spoke of long habit, a particular mind that kept things in consistent relation to each other. She noticed that June's stall had a small shelf built into the corner at a height that made sense only if the person using it intended to sit on the floor and reach up. A shelf for a lantern, placed by someone who spent time in this stall in the dark. She was threading a leather lace through a repaired girth strap when Callum appeared in the barn doorway. He stopped when he saw the saddle. Something moved through his expression. Not displeasure, she thought, but something more complicated. He came forward and stood on the other side of the workbench, looking at what she had done. "Where did you learn that?" he said. Ada looked up. "What?" He reached out and touched the repaired area of the leather with 2 fingers, the place where she had resewn a failing seam using a cross-stitch that was not common, not the technique most saddlers used, but one she had worked out herself over years of practice. A technique that began with a particular understanding of where the tension in the leather wanted to go and how to redirect it. "That stitch," he said. Ada set down the lace. She looked at the stitch and then at his hand resting near it, and she said carefully, "I don't know that I learned it anywhere specifically. It's just how my hands do it when the leather needs particular strength at the joint." She paused. "Is something wrong with it?" "No," Callum said. He withdrew his hand and put it in his coat pocket. Nothing wrong with it. He looked at her for a moment with that same expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that came when she said or did something that connected to information she didn't have. It's just an unusual technique. I've only seen it done that way once before. He did not say who had done it that way before. He went back to the main doors of the barn and disappeared into the yard, and Ada sat at the workbench for a long time after he left, her hands still on the leather, her mind very quiet and very busy at the same time. On the fourth day, a woman came to the ranch. Ada was in the kitchen garden when she heard the sound of a wagon on the drive. She had been turning the last of the dark soil in the bed along the south wall of the house, working it with a hand fork she had found in the shed, because the bed had been dug over and left, and something in her could not leave prepared earth unattended. She straightened up and shaded her eyes against the low winter sun. The wagon was driven by a woman of perhaps 60, compact and upright, with white hair pinned under a practical hat, and the kind of face that had been handsome in youth, and had become something more interesting with age. She drove with the easy competence of someone who had been managing horses since before Ada was born. The woman pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard and climbed down with no assistance and no particular haste. She looked at Ada across the distance between them with an expression of such concentrated, startled recognition that Ada felt it almost as a physical thing. A hand pressed against her sternum, pushing gently. "You must be Ruth," Ada said, before she had entirely decided to say it. The letter had mentioned a Ruth, briefly, in passing. A woman who had known her mother, had been her friend. The woman called Ruth walked toward her. She stopped at the edge of the garden bed, close enough that Ada could see the careful control in her face, the effort of holding steady against something that wanted to break through. "Lord," Ruth said softly. She was not speaking to Ada. She was speaking to the air, or to herself, or to someone who was not there. "Lord, you have her hands." Ada looked down at her own hands, dirt-stained, capable, holding the small fork loosely at her side. She looked back up. "Whose hands?" she asked, though some quiet part of her already knew. Ruth pressed her lips together. She shook her head very slightly, not denying the question but organizing herself against it, finding the right architecture of words for what needed to be said. Then she looked past Ada toward the house, and her expression shifted into something more guarded. "Is Callum here?" she asked. "He's in the north pasture. He won't be back until mid-afternoon." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Perhaps we could have some tea." They sat at the kitchen table with tea that Ada made from the dried herbs she had found in the jar on the shelf. She had identified them correctly as chamomile and something else, something she could not name precisely, but that reminded her, in the way that smells do, of a warm and enclosed space from long ago, something from before language. Ruth did not speak immediately. She held her cup in both hands and looked out the window at the yard and gathered herself with the patience of someone who understood that certain conversations, once begun, could not be unbegun. "I knew your mother," she said finally, "for years before she left, and after. When she came back, the last time," she paused, "she told me about you. What she believed had happened to you, and what she only found out much later." Ada set her cup down. Her hands were very still. "Tell me," she said. Ruth looked at her with the eyes of someone carrying a long weight. "Your mother didn't leave you by choice," she said. I need you to understand that first, before anything else. What happened? It was done to her as much as it was done to you. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the pines on the ridge. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses shifted, and the structure settled with a low, wooden sound. There was a man, Ruth said. A man she trusted. His name was Garrett. She stopped. She looked at Ada's face carefully. You've heard that name. Shaw, Ada said. Her voice was very even. Garrett Shaw. Ruth nodded slowly. Callum's older brother. Your mother came to this valley because of Garrett, because he had persuaded her that this was where she was meant to be, that he was the person she was meant to be with. She was young. She was alone. He was... Ruth paused, searching for the honest word. Very convincing. Ada waited. When your mother realized what Garrett truly was, Ruth continued, she was already beyond the point where leaving was simple. And then you were born. And for a little while, I think you were all the reason she needed to believe things could still be made right. Ruth's voice was steady, but it cost her something. That steadiness. Garrett was afraid of her leaving, afraid of losing control over what he had. So he removed the reason for her to stay and made sure she believed she had lost it forever. The silence that followed was long and absolute. Ada could feel her own heartbeat in a way that was unusual, a slow and very heavy rhythm, like something large moving in deep water. She thought I was dead, Ada said. It was not a question. For years, Ruth said. Yes. Ada stood up. She did not do it dramatically. She simply needed to be on her feet. She walked to the window and stood looking out at the yard, at the gray sky and the dark shape of the barn and the line of pines along the ridge. Her reflection hovered faintly in the glass, transparent, superimposed over the landscape outside. How did she find out I was alive? She asked. Garrett told her, Ruth said. When he was dying. It was the only thing he did in the end that cost him anything. And even then, I'm not certain it was conscience. Some people confess because they need the weight lifted. It doesn't mean they understand what they set down. Ada pressed her fingers against the cold glass of the window. And Callum? Ruth was quiet for a moment. Callum didn't know, she said carefully. What his brother did, Callum was not part of it. I want you to be certain of that. He was away when you were born. He came home to find your mother already broken, Garrett already rewriting what had happened. By the time Callum understood that something was badly wrong, years had passed and Garrett had... She stopped. Callum is not his brother, Ada. Ada turned from the window. She looked at Ruth. The older woman held her gaze without flinching. Then why, Ada said slowly, did my mother send me to him? Ruth set her cup down on the table. She folded her hands. Because of all the people in the world your mother knew, she said, Callum Shaw was the only one who knew the full truth of what had happened. The only one who had eventually confronted his brother and been told everything. And when she found out you were alive and she didn't have enough time left to reach you herself, Ruth paused. She needed someone to tell you. Someone who would not flinch from it. Someone who would make sure you understood not just what happened, but... She hesitated, choosing with care. That it was not because you weren't worth staying for. The wind pressed against the house. The lamp on the table burned very steadily. Ada did not cry. She had been not crying at significant moments for most of her life, and she was very practiced at it. But something shifted in her face, some arrangement of the muscles around her eyes and mouth that she could not entirely control, something that moved through like weather and passed and left the landscape slightly changed. "He knows," Ada said. "Callum knows everything, and he hasn't told me." "He will," Ruth said. "He's not withholding it to be cruel. He's trying to find a way to tell you something that breaks two people at once, Ada. Give him a little more time." Ada looked at the shelf along the far wall, at the small journal with a faded blue cloth tie. "Whose journal is that?" she asked. Ruth followed her gaze, and the expression that crossed her face was answer enough. That evening, when Callum came back from the north pasture, Ada was on the porch. She had the small piece of canvas out again, needle moving through it with slow, steady rhythm. The light was going fast, and she worked by what remained of it. And when his boots sounded on the bottom step, she did not look up. He stopped. She could feel him looking at her. She could feel him calculating. Whether Ruth had come, whether anything had been said, how much of the landscape had shifted while he was away. "Ruth was here," Ada said. A pause. "I know. I saw her wagon tracks in the drive." Ada pulled the thread through, even, firm. "She told me about my mother, and about Garrett." She looked up then, directly. "She didn't tell me everything. She said that was yours to tell." Callum was very still on the bottom step. The last light caught the side of his face, and she could see, very clearly, the weight of what he was carrying. The years of it, the specific gravity of a truth held too long in silence. "I owe you that," he said quietly. "Yes," Ada said. "You do." He came up the steps and sat down on the opposite end of the porch bench, leaving a careful distance between them. He took his hat off and held it in his hands, turning the brim slowly. The gesture of a man preparing himself. Ada put her needlework away and folded her hands in her lap and waited. And somewhere in the barn, behind the closed main doors, an old gray horse named June stood in her clean stall and breathed the warm, patient air. And the lantern on the hook above her burned with the steady light of something that had not yet been extinguished, despite everything. Callum opened his mouth to speak, and at that exact moment, from the far end of the drive, came the sound of a horse moving fast. Not the comfortable canter of a ranch hand returning late, but the sharp, urgent pace of someone riding with purpose, riding towards something rather than away from it. Both Ada and Callum turned. The rider who appeared out of the darkening distance was not someone Ada recognized. He was well dressed for the frontier, coat too clean, hat too new, and he pulled his horse to a stop in the yard with the confident, practiced motion of a man who was accustomed to arriving places and having people pay attention to his arrival. He looked at Callum. Then he looked at Ada. Then he looked back at Callum, and something moved through his expression. Quick, controlled, but not quick enough. "Shaw," the man said. His voice was smooth and carried easily across the yard. "I heard you had company." His eyes returned to Ada, and she felt the assessment in his gaze. Precise, calculating, the look of a man determining the value of something he had not expected to find. "I wanted to come and welcome your guest personally." Callum stood up slowly from the bench. He was very still in the way that certain large, quiet things are still, not passive, but gathered. "Harris," he said. "Just the name. Nothing else." Ada looked at the man called Harris and felt the hairs rise on the back of her neck with the particular instinct that had kept her safe in difficult situations before. The instinct that recognized, beneath the clean coat and the smooth voice and the practiced social ease, something that was not safe at all. She did not look away from him, and he did not look away from her. Harris Doyle did not stay long that first evening. He was the kind of man who understood the value of a short visit, who knew that arriving, being seen, and departing before he could be questioned was more effective than any longer engagement. He made pleasant conversation for perhaps 10 minutes, standing in the yard with his horse's reins loose in one gloved hand, asking Callum about the north pasture fence and the condition of the late-season herd with the easy familiarity of someone who considered himself entitled to such information. He did not ask Ada any direct questions. He simply looked at her, at intervals, with that precise and calculating attention, as though she were a column of figures he was adding up in his head and had not yet reached a satisfying sum. When he left, the sound of his horse's hooves faded quickly into the dark, and the yard felt larger for his absence, and colder. Callum stood at the top of the porch steps, watching the drive long after Harris Doyle had disappeared. Ada watched Callum. "Who is he?" she asked. "He owns the land adjacent to the eastern boundary of this property," Callum said. "Bought it some years back, from Garrett's estate." He said his brother's name, the way people say the names of the dead when the grief and the anger have not yet sorted themselves into separate things. Flatly, without inflection, as though the name itself were a bruise being pressed. Ada thought about what Ruth had told her, about Garrett, about the land. Is that arrangement, the sale, uncomplicated? Callum turned from the drive and looked at her. In the lamplight from the kitchen window, his face was very readable for once, not because his control had slipped, but because he had apparently decided, in the last few minutes, to let her see something real. "No," he said. "It is not uncomplicated." He went inside. Ada followed, and this time, when he sat down at the kitchen table and placed his hat on the chair beside him, she sat across from him and did not reach for her needlework, or look at the shelf, or offer him any of the small courtesies of deflection. She simply sat and waited, and let the silence do its work. Callum looked at the table, then he looked at her. Then he said, "I'll tell you what I know, all of it. But I need you to understand that some of what I'm going to say, I have carried it for a long time, and I have not said it aloud to another person, and I may not do it gracefully." "I'm not looking for grace," Ada said. "I'm looking for the truth." He nodded once, and he began. He told it the way people tell things they have rehearsed many times in private, not smoothly, not with the ease of a practiced storyteller, but with the particular halting rhythm of someone who has gone over the material so many times it has worn grooves. And now the words fall into those grooves, whether they want to or not. Garrett Shaw had been 10 years older than Callum. By the time Callum was old enough to understand the shape of his brother's character, that character was already fully formed. The charm that worked on nearly everyone, the intelligence that bent naturally toward advantage, the deep and private contempt for anything he could not control. Callum had spent most of his childhood watching people trust his brother and then be diminished by that trust. And he had learned early to keep a careful distance from Garrett's orbit while remaining as the younger brother of a man like that, inevitably within its pull. Their father's ranch had been left to both of them jointly. Callum had bought Garrett out over time, quietly, methodically, paying fair value and keeping records, because he understood that with Garrett, every transaction needed documentation. By the time Callum's wife came to the ranch, the property was effectively his, though Garrett still held certain interests in the eastern parcels, the portions that abutted the creek and held the best water access. Then Callum's wife died, and in the grief that followed, Callum had not been watching carefully enough, and Garrett had moved. He had found Ada's mother, a young woman traveling alone, skilled and intelligent, and entirely without resources or connections in this part of the world, and he had done what Garrett always did with things he wanted. He had made her believe she was choosing freely while removing every other option. He had brought her to the valley, installed her in a portion of the eastern land that was technically his, and built walls around her life so gradually and so skillfully that by the time she understood what the walls were, they were already too high to see over. Callum had been away for much of this, managing the ranch, grieving his wife, doing the work of a man who has nothing left to anchor himself except labor. When he came home and found his brother had a woman living on the eastern land, he had asked questions and received answers that were plausible enough to satisfy a man who wanted, in his exhaustion and grief, to be satisfied. He paused here. He looked at his hands on the table, the hands of a man who had spent his life doing physical work, the knuckles enlarged, the skin thick and scored with old scars. He looked at them the way people look at evidence of their own failures. "I should have asked more," he said. "I knew something was wrong. I could see it in her face when I came to the eastern land to check the fence line, and she was in the yard. She had the look." He stopped. He pressed his mouth together briefly. She had the look of someone who had been told, very thoroughly, that no one was coming for her. I had seen that look before, on animals. I should have recognized it on a person. Ada's hands were very still in her lap. She did not speak. "She was carrying you by then," Callum said, "nearly full term. I asked Garrett directly what his intentions were, what the arrangement was, what she understood of her situation. He told me it was none of my concern, that she was content, that she had chosen to be there." He was quiet for a moment. I believed him, because believing him was easier than the alternative. That is the truth, and I am not proud of it. He told her the rest without embellishment. He had gone back to the main portion of the ranch. He had been away again, a long trip to negotiate the sale of cattle. When word came that there had been a child, and then, very shortly after, that the child had not survived. Garrett had told everyone this. The story had settled into the community's understanding the way water settles into low ground, finding every hollow and filling it. By the time Callum returned, the story was already the history. Ada's mother had been diminished after that, in the way that people are diminished by a grief too large to be fully processed and too isolating to be shared. She had stayed on the eastern land for another season, and then she had left. And Garrett had let her go, because she was no longer useful and no longer interesting, and he had already found other things to occupy his attention. Callum had not seen her again for many years. She came back once, he said, long after Garrett was gone. She was ill by then, had been ill for some time, I think, though she didn't say so directly. She came to the ranch, to the main house. He looked up from his hands. She told me what Garrett had confessed to her before he died, about the child, about you. He held Ada's gaze with great steadiness, the steadiness of a man delivering something precious and breakable across a difficult distance. She had found out you were alive. She knew where you were. She knew you had grown up and made your own life. And she was dying, and she could not reach you. And she asked me, she made me promise, that if you came here, I would tell you everything, all of it, without leaving out the parts that are hard to say. The kitchen was entirely quiet. The lamp burned. Outside, the wind had eased to almost nothing, and the silence that remained was the deep, textured silence of open country at night, full of small sounds that together created a kind of stillness. "Why didn't you contact me yourself?" Ada asked. Her voice was even. "You knew I was alive. You knew where I was." "Yes," Callum said simply. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I am the brother of the man who did this to you," he said. "And because your mother asked me to wait, to let you come to me if you chose to, or not to come, if that was your choice. She said you deserved to decide for yourself whether this was a door you wanted to open." He paused. "And because I was afraid," he said, with the particular difficulty of a man not accustomed to using that word, "that if I came to you, you would see only what I am connected to, not who I am separate from it." The word afraid sat on the table between them like something set down carefully from a great height. Ada looked at him for a long time. She looked at the lines of his face, and the weight behind his eyes, and the hands that were still on the table, not performing anything, just resting there in the way that honest things rest, without arrangement. "She trusted you," Ada said finally. "Not a question." "She said I was the only one she trusted," Callum said. "I don't know that I deserved it, but I have tried, since she told me, to be worthy of it after the fact." He held her gaze. "That is the most I can say." Ada stood up. She walked to the shelf along the far wall. She stood in front of the small journal with the faded blue cloth tie and looked at it without touching it for a long moment. "That's hers," she said. "Yes." "She left it here. She said it was for you, if you came." He paused. "I haven't read it. It's tied shut, and it was given to me for you, and I have not read it." Ada reached out and picked the journal up. It was lighter than she expected. She held it in both hands and felt the worn cover, the cloth tie, the slight warping of the pages from age, and the subtle changes in temperature that all old buildings impose on the things kept inside them. She pressed it gently between her palms, as though she could feel something through the covers. She stood like that for a long moment. Then she turned around and set the journal on the table in front of her chair, not opening it, not yet, and sat back down. "Tell me about her," she said. "Not what happened to her. Tell me what she was like." Callum looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not the breaking of composure, but the softening of it, the way stone looks different when light falls on it from an unexpected angle. And he told her. He told her about a woman with quick hands and a precise mind who had learned to ride in a single season because she was determined to be useful and not decorative, who had an opinion about nearly everything and expressed those opinions in a dry, understated way that made people laugh before they quite realized they were laughing, who had kept a kitchen garden on the eastern land that produced more than could be used, and who had quietly distributed the excess to families in the outer reaches of the valley who would not have asked for help if offered it directly, who had a habit, when thinking hard about something, of pressing 2 fingers to the side of her jaw, a habit so specific and so physical that when Callum described it, Ada's own hand rose involuntarily to her own jaw before she caught it. She brought her hand back to the table. Callum saw. He did not say anything about it, but something settled in his expression. some long-held tension releasing fractionally, like a wire eased back from its fullest extension. "She would have liked you," he said. "I think she did, in the way that you can like someone you know only from a distance. She used to talk about the person you might have become, what kind of life you might have built." He stopped. "She said she thought you would have her hands." Ada looked down at her hands on the table, capable and work-worn, the needle callus on the right index finger, the particular way the thumb bent slightly outward at rest. She had always thought of them as simply her hands, functional, unremarkable, belonging only to herself. She thought of Ruth, standing at the edge of the kitchen garden, saying, "Lord, you have her hands." She pressed her palms flat against the table and held them there. They sat by the fire later that evening, not because either of them had suggested it, but because the kitchen had grown cold, and the hearth in the front room was the logical place to be. And they had arrived there by the natural drift of two people who were no longer keeping a careful, deliberate distance. Callum added wood to the fire without being asked. Ada had the journal in her hands, still closed, the blue tie still knotted. She was not ready to open it yet. She understood something about herself in this moment, that she needed to carry the weight of it a little longer before she was ready to know what was inside. That there was a difference between being ready for the truth and being ready for the particular, irreplaceable words that were the truth of a specific person. She looked at the fire instead. "Your wife," she said. "What was she like?" Callum was quiet for a moment. He was sitting in the wooden chair across from the one she occupied, his elbows on his knees, looking at the fire. The firelight moved across his face in long, warm strokes. "Patient," he said. "More patient than I deserved." She had a way of waiting for the best version of a situation to emerge, even when the worst version was what was actually present. He paused. "She used to say that people reveal themselves eventually, if you give them enough room. That judgment was mostly just impatience dressed up as discernment." Ada considered this. "She sounds wise." She was. A pause. "She would have told me to contact you years ago. She would not have understood the reasoning I gave myself for waiting." He looked up from the fire. "She had very little patience for the kind of caution that is actually just fear rearranged." Ada felt something shift in her chest, a small, careful movement, like a door opening inward. "You built the new railing on the porch," she said. "The left side, recently." He looked at her. The shift in subject did not appear to confuse him. "Yes." "And the cracks in the upper window, you filled them yourself, very carefully." "Yes." "You maintain this house," she said, "as though someone is going to come home to it." The fire crackled. A log shifted, sending a small cascade of sparks up the chimney. Callum looked at her with an expression that she had not seen on his face before. Not the guarded assessment of the first days, not the careful control of the kitchen conversations, but something more open, more undefended, the expression of a person who has been seen accurately and is deciding how to respond to that accuracy. "Old habit," he said. "Or hope," Ada said. He did not answer, but he did not look away either, and in the silence that followed, the fire burned steadily between them, and the wind outside the house was very quiet, and Ada thought that this was what it felt like when two people stopped performing distance and simply occupied the same space, not without caution, not without the full awareness of everything that had brought them here and everything that remained unresolved, but without the exhausting effort of pretending the distance was greater than it actually was. She untied the journal. She did not open it immediately. She just loosened the knot and let the cloth tie fall open, and held the journal in her lap with the cover still closed, getting used to the idea of what was inside. Callum watched her without speaking. He was very good at being present without being intrusive. She had noticed this over the days she had been here, the way he occupied space without filling it unnecessarily. It was, she thought, a quality that must have been cultivated deliberately by a man who had spent a long time understanding that the people around him needed room. She opened the journal. The handwriting on the first page was not what she had expected. She had been bracing herself for grief, for the cramped, urgent script of someone writing against time and failing health. But the first entry was written in a clear, unhurried hand, the letters well-formed and even, as though the writer had sat down in a place of relative peace and chosen her words with care. It began, "There are things I would have told you if I had been given the ordinary chance. Since I was not, I am writing them down instead and trusting that the right hands will carry them to you." Ada read slowly. The fire burned low, and Callum added wood without interrupting her. At some point, he brought 2 cups of coffee and set one beside her chair without a word, and she drank it without looking up. The journal was not long, perhaps 40 pages of the small, close writing, but she read each page with full attention, the way you read something you know you will need to carry with you afterward. She did not cry, but there were several moments when she had to stop and look at the fire and breathe very deliberately, the way you breathe when you are managing something large in a small space. When she reached the last page, she sat still for a long time. Then she said, without looking up from the page, "She says here that she came to the ranch that last time because she needed to know if you were all right. After everything." She paused. "She says she asked you if you blamed her for not fighting harder, for not finding a way out sooner. And she says you told her." Ada stopped. Her voice had changed slightly. She steadied it. "She says you told her that the only person who had done something wrong was the one who set the fire, not the one who got burned." Callum said nothing, but his hands, resting on the arms of the wooden chair, were very still. "She says she cried when you said that," Ada continued, "and that you handed her your handkerchief without looking at her, so she wouldn't have to manage her face while you were watching." Ada looked up from the journal. "She says it was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in many years." Callum was looking at the fire. His jaw was set in the way she had come to recognize, not hardness, but the management of something that was not hard at all. "She was easy to be kind to," he said quietly. "People who have been treated unkindly for a long time, they notice kindness very clearly. It doesn't take much." Ada closed the journal. She held it in both hands in her lap and looked at the man across the fire from her and understood, with the particular clarity that comes after a long accumulation of small observations has finally reached a critical weight, several things simultaneously. That Callum Shaw was not a man who had built walls because he did not feel things, but because he felt them very completely and had not known for a long time what to do with that. That his brother had left damage in this house that Callum was still, quietly and without complaint, repairing. And that her mother, in sending her here, had understood something about this man that Ada was only beginning to understand herself. "There's more in the journal," Ada said, "about you." About what she hoped. She paused. She was not subtle, exactly, but she was careful about it. Callum looked at her then. About me? About the kind of person she thought you were, Ada said. And about... She stopped. She looked at the journal in her hands. She had been watching over me, from a distance, for years. She knew things about my life, my work, the places I had lived. She looked up. She wrote about the kind of person she thought I had become. And she wrote about you. And she hoped. Ada felt the particular difficulty of saying the next part, not because it was painful, but because it was large, and large things require care in the handling. She hoped that if we found each other, we might... She stopped again. Might what? Callum asked. His voice was very quiet. That we might not both be so alone, Ada said. The fire settled. The room was warm and still. Outside, somewhere on the ridge, an owl called once and was answered by silence. Callum looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze and did not look away, and there was in that mutual looking a kind of recognition that had nothing to do with the information they had exchanged over the past days and everything to do with the thing underneath information, the thing that existed before words and remained after them. I should have reached out to you sooner, he said. Yes, Ada agreed. I was afraid of what I represented to you, what my name represented. I know. I'm still... He stopped. He looked at his hands, then back at her. I am not entirely certain I know how to be in the same room as someone without keeping most of myself behind something. It has been a long time since I practiced otherwise. Ada looked at him with the quiet attention she had been giving to the things in this house, the careful eye of someone who saw structure beneath surface, who understood what held and what yielded, who knew that the right repair was not the one that filled the gap fastest, but the one that understood why the gap had formed. You've been doing fine, she said. Outside, a sound broke the quiet of the yard. Not the owl this time, not the wind, but the deliberate and purposeful sound of a horse being ridden slowly around the outer boundary of the ranch, the hoofbeats pausing at the edge of the drive and then moving on. Both Ada and Callum heard it. Callum stood. He went to the window and looked out into the dark yard for a long moment. His face, reflected faintly in the glass, was very still. Harris Doyle, Ada said. It was not a question. He rides the boundary at night sometimes, Callum said. He calls it neighborliness. He continued looking out the window. It started when your mother came back that last time. It has not stopped since. Ada stood and came to stand beside him at the window. They looked out together at the dark yard, at the shapes of the outbuildings and the line of pines against the slightly lighter sky, and somewhere beyond the boundary fence, the sound of the slow, deliberate hoofbeats making their circuit and then fading into the distance. He knows why I'm here, Ada said. Yes, Callum said. I believe he does. Ada looked at her own reflection in the glass, the transparent, superimposed version of herself, visible only because of the darkness outside. She thought about the journal in her hands and the stitch on the saddle that her hands had made without knowing they were repeating something, and the name on the stone in the cemetery that was not her mother's name but was connected to it, and the horse called June who had been tended all these years with a care that was not about utility. She thought about Harris Doyle riding the boundary in the dark, and what it meant that he had started when her mother returned, and what it meant that he had not stopped. He's afraid of something, she said, something that becomes possible now that I'm here. Callum turned from the window. He looked at her directly, and in his expression was the confirmation she had not quite needed because she already knew, but which was clarifying to receive nonetheless. "Yes," he said. "And tomorrow I think we need to talk about what that is." Ada nodded. She looked one last time at the dark yard, at the place where the hoofbeats had been, at the empty drive and the cedar tree at the gate that bent permanently westward. "Tomorrow," she agreed. She held the journal carefully against her chest as she walked back toward the warmth of the fire, and Callum followed, and neither of them suggested that it was time to sleep, because there are conversations that, once begun, change the quality of the silence around them, and some silences are better not returned to alone. The next morning arrived with unusual stillness. The wind that had been a constant presence since Ada's first day in the valley was gone, and in its absence, the landscape felt different. Exposed, somehow, the way a face looks different when the expression it habitually wears has been removed. The pines on the ridge stood perfectly vertical. The dry grass in the valley did not move. Even the horses in the barn were quieter than usual, moving with a subdued, attentive quality, as though they too were waiting for something. Callum had the document spread on the kitchen table when Ada came downstairs. He had retrieved from the locked drawer of the desk in the study a collection of papers that he laid out with careful, deliberate organization. Land records, sale agreements, a letter written in a formal hand that bore Garrett's signature at the bottom. She sat down across from him and looked at the papers without touching them. Garrett's estate, Callum said, included the eastern parcels, the creek land, the water access. Those were the portions he held separately from the main ranch, the ones I had not yet bought back from him at the time he died. When he died without a direct heir, the estate should have reverted to me as the surviving family member. He paused. Harris Doyle claims that Garrett sold the eastern land to him before he died. He has a document to that effect. The document is dated correctly and bears what appears to be Garrett's signature. "Appears to be," Ada said. "Garrett was ill for the last months of his life. Very ill. The handwriting on the document, I have looked at it many times, is not consistent with how Garrett wrote when he was well. It has the quality of a signature produced by a person whose hand was being guided." Callum looked at her steadily. "I have no proof of this. I have only my knowledge of my brother's handwriting across 30 years, and my certainty, which a court of law is not required to share." Ada looked at the papers. "And the water access, the creek land. Why does it matter enough for Doyle to go to this trouble?" "Because the valley is changing," Callum said. "There are people coming. The kind of people who come before the larger changes arrive, who buy land they understand will become valuable before others understand the same thing. The creek land controls water access for the entire eastern portion of the valley. Whoever holds that land holds something that will become extremely valuable as more people settle here." He paused. "Doyle is not a rancher. He does not use the land he has. He holds it." Ada was quiet for a moment. "And if it were demonstrated that the sale document was fraudulent, that Garrett could not have signed it competently at that stage of his illness, the land would revert to you." "Yes. And Doyle knows this. He has always known it. What he did not know was whether your mother had told anyone else what Garrett confessed to her before he died. Whether there were other things Garrett had said, other admissions, that might complicate the legal situation further." He held her gaze. "When your mother came back here, Doyle started watching. When she left, he continued watching. And when you arrived, he understood that she might have sent information with you, or that you might carry something she passed to you that you don't even know is relevant. Ada looked at the journal, which she had placed on the corner of the table. "There's something in the journal," she said. "Something my mother wrote in the last entries about Garrett's final weeks. She describes his condition very precisely. She wrote that he could not hold a cup without assistance, that the effort of speech cost him greatly, that she had to lean close to hear him." She looked up. If someone were to read this account and compare it with the date on Doyle's sale document, it would raise serious questions about how Garrett could have produced a legible signature on that date, Callum said. "It's not proof," Ada said. "No. But it is testimony. Your mother's testimony, recorded in her own hand." He was watching her carefully. "A journal can be challenged. Its authenticity can be questioned. But it exists, and Doyle doesn't know what's in it, or whether it's relevant. And that uncertainty is what's been driving him to the boundary fence at night." Ada closed the journal. She thought about what it meant that her mother had left it here, with Callum, knowing that it might be needed. That she had understood the truth might have consequences beyond the personal, and had recorded it carefully and entrusted it to the one person she believed would handle it with integrity. Ada set the journal on the table between them. "We need to speak to Ruth," she said. "She was here during those years. She may know other people who witnessed Garrett's condition in those final months." Callum was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There is something else you should know, before we involve anyone else. Doyle came to see me 2 days before you arrived," Callum said. "He told me he had heard that a woman was traveling west, that she might be coming here. He said that if anyone came to this ranch claiming a connection to Garrett's estate or to events surrounding Garrett's death, I should send them away. That pursuing old history would only cause harm." He met Ada's eyes. He said this in the way that a man says something when he wants it understood as a warning without having to state it as one. Ada looked at him steadily. "And you didn't send me away." "No," Callum said. "I did not." The silence between them held that word, the simple, flat no of it, and everything it contained. They went to Ruth that afternoon. She received them in her kitchen with the unruffled composure of a person who had been expecting this visit. Ada placed the journal on Ruth's kitchen table and opened it to the final entries. Ruth read slowly. Her expression did not change dramatically, but Ada watched her hands, which tightened slightly on the edge of the table as she read, and then released, and then tightened again. When she finished, Ruth looked up. "She was thorough," she said. Her voice was steady and very fond. "She was always thorough." "Can you corroborate any of this?" Callum asked. "Garrett's condition in those final weeks, whether he was capable of executing documents." "I can do more than that," Ruth said. She went to the shelf above her fireplace and retrieved a small wooden box. She brought it to the table and opened it without ceremony. Inside, among other papers, was a letter. "Garrett wrote to me that final month. He wrote to several people. It was part of how he operated, trying to manage his reputation even at the end." She pushed the letter across the table. "Look at the signature." Callum and Ada looked. The signature was barely legible, a trembling, effortful mark that bore only a distant family resemblance to the confident script on the sale document Callum had at home. "Same month," Ruth said, tapping the date at the top of the letter. "Within weeks of the date on Doyle's paper." Ada looked at Callum. He was looking at the signature with an expression that was not triumph. It was too sober for that. But it was the expression of a man who has been holding a truth alone for a long time and has just felt the weight of it shared. This needs to go before the community, Ada said. A public accounting is harder to silence than a private one. And the people of this valley, if they know the truth about the creek land, about what Doyle holds and how he holds it, they have their own stake in this. Ruth was looking at Ada with an expression that was partly assessment and partly something warmer. Your mother used to argue that way, she said, not with volume, with the simple logic of what was fair, stated plainly in front of people who were capable of understanding it. I know, Ada said. I'm counting on that. The community gathering happened 3 days later. Redstone Crossing held such gatherings periodically, a practical necessity in places where people lived spread across significant distances. Callum had requested time to address the community, and his standing in the valley was sufficient that the request was honored without much question. Doyle was there. He arrived before them and had positioned himself with the practiced ease of a man who understood spatial politics. Near the front, visible, flanked by 2 associates whose primary quality was size. He watched Ada and Callum come in with an expression of pleasant, open interest that did not reach his eyes. Ada had dressed carefully, not elaborately, but with the specific intention of appearing exactly as she was, a capable, plainly dressed woman of no particular social pretension and no particular anxiousness. She wore her good coat, which was clean and well-maintained, and she carried the journal under her arm, and she walked beside Callum without looking at Doyle or at the watching faces of the gathered community. She looked instead at the people in the room, neighbors who shared fence lines and water sources, families who depended on the creek access for stock and household use. She saw, in the faces around her, the pragmatic wariness of people who had survived in a difficult landscape through cooperation and who understood, at a functional level, that the control of water was the control of survival. Callum addressed the gathering first. He spoke without performance, simply stating what he knew and how he knew it, laying the elements of the situation in front of the community, the way he might lay tools on a workbench, functional and clearly organized. He described the eastern land. He described Garrett's illness. He described the sale document and the questions surrounding its authenticity. Doyle interrupted before Callum had finished, with the well-calibrated timing of someone who had prepared for this moment. Shaw is a man with a grievance, he said, addressing the room rather than Callum directly. The document is legitimate. The signature has been witnessed and recorded. He paused, and in the pause his eyes moved to Ada. And I would note that this claim is being advanced now because a stranger has arrived, a woman with no documented connection to this valley, whose appearance conveniently coincides with this sudden interest in relitigating settled matters. The room shifted. Ada felt it, the movement of attention, the slight recalibration of collective judgment. She stood up. She did not do it dramatically. She simply rose from her seat and waited until the room's attention found her. My name is Ada Merritt, she said. Her voice carried easily without being raised. I came to this valley to find the truth about my mother, who lived here and was wronged here and died without being able to return here herself. I am not making a legal claim. I am not contesting the sale document directly. I am going to read you something. She opened the journal. She read from the final entries, her mother's account of Garrett's last days, the confession, the specific and carefully observed details of a man's physical condition in the final weeks of his life. She read clearly and without commentary, letting the words do the work they had been written to do. Her mother's voice on the page was exactly what it had been in person, Ruth had said. Precise, honest, without self-pity. When she finished, she set the journal down and picked up Ruth's letter. This was written by Garrett Shaw to a member of this community, she said, dated within weeks of the sale document Mr. Doyle holds. She held it up so the room could see it, then passed it to the person nearest her, who looked at it and passed it on. It moved through the room with the particular weight of evidence that people have not been asked to believe, but simply to see. "Compare the signatures," Ada said. "Draw your own conclusions." Doyle's composure had not broken, but his hands, she noticed, had moved from their relaxed position to something slightly different. One gripping the back of the chair in front of him, the knuckles not white but not relaxed either. "A journal can be written at any time," Doyle said. "Its dates cannot be verified. A grieving woman's account of a dying man's words is not evidence of anything except grief." "No," Ada agreed. "It is not legal evidence. It is a record." She looked at him directly. "And records have a way of persisting, of being read by the right people at the right time." She looked around the room. "The eastern parcels control the water access for every property on this side of the ridge. Every family in this room has an interest in whether the man who holds that land holds it legitimately." The room was very quiet. Then one of the older ranchers, a heavy-set man with a slow, deliberate manner who had said nothing until this moment, leaned forward and said to Doyle, in the conversational tone of someone asking a perfectly ordinary question, "Old Silas Pemberton, who worked the Shaw Ranch, he was present for Garrett's last weeks, wasn't he? Used to come to my place and talk about it after. Said Garrett couldn't lift his own hand to eat by the end." The gathering's attention moved to Doyle with the unhurried collective shift of people who have begun to put something together. "This is not a court," Doyle said. "Nothing decided here has legal weight." "No," the rancher agreed pleasantly, "but we all talk to each other. And some of us know people in the appropriate offices, and some of those people might find it worthwhile to look more carefully at a document that's starting to attract this much question." Doyle left the gathering before it formally concluded. He walked out with his associates at a pace that was controlled and deliberate, not the pace of a man fleeing, but not the pace of a man who intended to return either. Ada watched him go and felt not triumph, but something more complicated. The particular sober satisfaction of a thing done that needed doing, mixed with the clear-eyed awareness that it was not finished. Callum was beside her when the room began to disperse. Ruth appeared on her other side. "He'll be back tonight," Ruth said quietly. "He'll want to know what you have and whether you intend to pursue it formally." "I know," Ada said. "Are you prepared for that?" Ada thought about the journal under her arm, about the stitch on the saddle, about June in the last stall, about 2 cups on a shelf, about the faded blue dress she had remembered since childhood, and the hands she had pressed flat on a kitchen table and recognized for the first time as something more than her own. "Yes," she said. Doyle came to the ranch that night. He came alone and on foot from the direction of the eastern boundary, which told her something about what kind of visit he intended. She heard him before she saw him, the particular sound of a person trying to move quietly across dry ground and not quite managing it. And she woke Callum with a hand on his arm. Callum was awake and on his feet before she had finished the motion. He went to the window and looked out, then moved to the door. Ada followed. Doyle was at the edge of the yard, near the barn. He had a lamp, held low, its light directed at the barn door. He was testing the latch with a careful, exploratory pressure. "Doyle." Callum's voice came from the porch, level and carrying. The man at the barn went still. "Whatever you're looking for," Callum said, "is not in the barn." A long pause. Then Doyle turned, raising the lamp. His face in the lamplight was different from his public face, stripped of the social ease, showing the thing underneath, which was cold in a way that was its own kind of danger. "I came to make you an offer, Shaw. A fair one." "At this hour," Callum said, through the back boundary. "I thought we might speak privately, without an audience." Doyle's eyes moved to Ada. "The journal. I'll give you the eastern parcels. I'll deed them back to Shaw, in exchange for the journal and any copies." Ada looked at him. "You want to buy my mother's words," she said. "I want to resolve this cleanly. You get the land. I get certainty. Everyone benefits." "Except the truth," Ada said. Doyle looked at her for a long moment. The lamp in his hand was steady. "You have nothing legally binding. A journal, a letter. They raise questions, but they prove nothing. You could spend years in dispute and arrive nowhere." He paused. "Take the land. Take the certainty. Walk away from the rest." Ada looked at the man in the yard with the lamp held low, and she felt something in her that was very clear and very calm. The clarity that comes not from the absence of fear, but from being on the correct side of a choice. She looked at Callum. He was watching her, not Doyle, waiting, as he had waited since the beginning, for her to decide at her own pace. "No," Ada said. Doyle's expression did not change. He nodded once, slowly, as though she had confirmed something he had already known. Then he turned the lamp down and walked back the way he had come, into the dark of the eastern boundary, and the sound of his footsteps faded, and the yard was silent again. Callum exhaled slowly. He turned to look at her. "He'll escalate," Callum said. "Yes," Ada said. "I know." She was looking at the barn, at the small side door, slightly ajar, and through it, just visible, the soft amber glow of a lamp burning on its post. And below the lamp, the shape of June standing in her stall with her head up, watching the dark yard with the patient attention of an animal that had seen many difficult nights, and understood that most of them eventually passed. "The barn," Ada said slowly. Doyle went to the barn. He wasn't looking for papers. He wasn't looking for the journal. She turned to Callum. "What's in the barn that he would want?" Callum was very still, and then something moved through his face. A rapid internal reorganization, the look of a man who has just understood something he should have understood earlier. "June," he said. "It's June." Ada looked at the barn, at the old gray horse in the last stall, tended with particular care, the stall shelf built at the height of someone sitting on the floor, the nameplate touched up, the hay always fresh. What does the horse have to do with... "The day Garrett signed his will," Callum said, "he was in the barn. He spent the last good morning he had in the barn. I remember it because it was unusual. He was not a man who spent time in barns for the pleasure of it, but he was there, with June, for most of the morning." Callum was moving toward the barn as he spoke, and Ada followed. "When he came in for the midday meal, I noticed he had something in his coat. He saw me notice, and he made a point of going directly to his room. I thought, nothing of it at the time. He pushed open the small barn door and stepped inside. June turned her head toward them as they entered. The lamp above her stall burned with steady warmth. Callum went to the shelf in the corner of the stall, the small shelf built at sitting height. He ran his hand along the underside of it, and then his hand stopped. Ada came to stand beside him. The underside of the shelf had a small panel, not obvious, simply a section of the wood fitted slightly differently from the rest that would not be noticed unless you were looking for it, or unless you happened to run your hand along the underside in the dark. Callum worked the panel loose. Behind it, in a space just large enough to hold a folded document, was a folded document. He took it out carefully. He unfolded it in the lamplight, and Ada read over his arm, and the two of them stood in the warm, hay-scented air of the barn while the old gray horse breathed quietly beside them, and they read what Garrett Shaw had left in the only place he had apparently trusted. It was a confession, not a legal document in any formal sense. It bore no witness, no seal, no official mark, but it was precise and specific, and in Garrett's own hand, and it described, in the plain language of a man who had perhaps decided at the very end to put something true into the world, exactly what he had done, and when, and why. The land arrangement with Doyle, the condition of the sale, his own assessment of his capacity at the time of signing, an assessment that was strikingly, almost clinically honest about his limitations. And at the bottom, in the last lines, a different kind of statement entirely. Not legal, not practical, just a man writing something down because the weight of it had become greater than the weight of silence. I hit a child. I told her mother the child was gone. The child's name, the name she was given, not the name I prevented her from having. I do not know. I hope she has had a life worth living. I hope she is kept from knowing what I am. But if she comes here looking, let her find this too. Let her know I knew, at the end, what I had done. It is all I have left to give. Callum's hand, holding the document, was not entirely steady. Ada reached out and put her hand over his, not to take the paper, just to steady it, the way you steady something you don't want to drop. His hand beneath hers was warm and very still, and after a moment she felt it settle, the trembling passing through and out. June breathed beside them. The lamp burned on its post. Outside, the valley was dark and enormous and entirely silent, the wind still absent, the stars sharply visible in the cold, clear sky. Ada read the last lines again. Let her find this too. Let her know I knew. She thought about what it meant. Not forgiveness. She was not ready for that word and was not certain she would ever be, but something adjacent to it. The acknowledgement that even in the worst of people there could be, at the very end, a small motion toward the truth. An inadequate motion, an insufficient one, but a motion nonetheless. She stood in the barn with her hand over Callum's hand and the document between them and felt the particular weight of a question that had been asked for most of her life, finally, imperfectly, answered. The document changed things in the practical world with a speed that surprised Ada, who had learned to expect the practical world to move slowly and reluctantly toward justice. Garrett's handwritten confession, combined with Ruth's letter, with the journal, with the testimony of the older rancher who knew Silas Pemberton, and with the collective, pragmatic concern of a community that had begun to ask its own questions about the Creekland, proved to be more than sufficient to prompt formal scrutiny from the appropriate authority. The process was not instantaneous. There were weeks of correspondence, of documents traveling back and forth, of people in distant offices reading things carefully and asking questions that needed answering in writing. Callum made the 2-day ride 3 times in the space of a month, and each time he returned with the particular expression of a man who is engaged in necessary, unglamorous work and is doing it without complaint because it is simply what needs doing. Ada stayed. She told herself in the first week that she stayed because the matter was not resolved and her presence was potentially useful. She told herself in the second week that she stayed because the weather had turned and the road was poor, and it made practical sense to wait. By the third week, she had stopped telling herself reasons and simply acknowledged in the quiet and private way of a person who has spent a long time being honest with herself about the things that matter, that she was staying because she wanted to be here, because the ranch had acquired, for her, the quality of a place that held something she recognized. Because the kitchen in the morning and the porch in the evening and the barn in the particular stillness of a windless night had become, without her entirely noticing the moment it happened, somewhere she did not want to leave. Doyle did not return to the ranch. He left the valley quietly, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had calculated his position and found it untenable, and was relocating before the full weight of consequence arrived. He was not the kind of man who waited to be confronted. He was the kind of man who managed his exits. Ada watched his wagon move along the eastern road one gray morning from the porch, and felt nothing dramatic, not relief, not satisfaction, just the quiet recognition that the thing that had needed to be finished was finishing. The eastern parcels, in time, reverted to Callum Shaw. He told Ada on a still evening, standing in the kitchen doorway with his coat still on from the ride back, holding the final letter in his hand with the same careful steadiness he brought to everything. He did not make a speech about it. He set the letter on the table, looked at her, and said, "It's done." And Ada looked at the letter and then at him and said, "Good." And that was sufficient, because they had both learned by then that between two people who understood each other's silences, the large things did not always require large words. She found the last note on a morning in early spring. She had been organizing the contents of the wooden box from the barn. The box she had discovered on her first night, the one that had held the photograph of her mother and the infant. Callum had given her the box without being asked, setting it on the kitchen table one afternoon, and going back outside without ceremony, understanding that some things needed to be done privately, and that the most useful contribution he could make was to be absent. Ada had been through the box before, but she had not been through it with the thoroughness she brought to it now, in the changed light of everything she had learned. She went through each item carefully, and at the very bottom, beneath the photograph and a small collection of items she recognized as her mother's, a folded ribbon, a single earring, a smooth river stone of the kind people carry for comfort. She found a piece of paper that had been folded very small and tucked into the corner seam of the box, invisible unless you press the tips of your fingers along the interior edges. She unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was her mother's, but different from the journal. Faster, smaller, the writing of someone setting something down quickly because the time available was uncertain. It said, "The gray mare came to me the morning after I arrived. She had been Garrett's horse once, years before, and she came to me anyway. I think animals understand things about people that people are still figuring out. Callum kept her when I left. He kept her all these years. He is not a man who abandons the things he has been entrusted with. That is why I trust him with the most important thing I have left to give. He will not let go of her. He will not let go of you either, if you give him the chance. I am sorry I cannot be there to see it, but I am glad, more than I can say, that you will not be alone. Ada sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the note in her hands. Then she folded it carefully and placed it inside the journal, between the last page of her mother's writing and the back cover, where it would be held safely without being hidden. She went outside. The morning was extraordinary in the way that certain mornings in high country are extraordinary. The light coming at a low angle across the valley floor, catching the frost on the grass and turning it briefly gold before the warmth of the rising sun dissolved it. The pines on the ridge were very dark against a sky that had returned, with the loosening of winter, to its full depth of blue. The air smelled of cold earth and resin and the particular freshness of a world that had been waiting through a long season for permission to begin again. Callum was at the fence line along the south pasture, working on a section of rail that had heaved over the winter. He had his coat off despite the cold, working with the focused efficiency that characterized everything he did physically. Not hurried, not wasted, simply competent in the unhurried way of a person who has made peace with the pace of necessary work. Ada walked across the yard and stood on the near side of the fence, watching him work. He looked up. He registered her expression. Whatever was in it, whatever the note and the morning light and the accumulated weight of the past weeks had arranged in her face, and he set down the tool he was holding and straightened up and looked at her fully, the way he had learned to look at her, without deflection, without management, simply present. There was another note, Ada said, in the box at the bottom. He waited. She wrote about June, Ada said, about how she came to her when she first arrived, about how you kept her. She paused. She wrote that a man who doesn't abandon what he's been entrusted with is a man who can be trusted. She held his gaze. She was right. Callum was quiet. The morning moved around them. A bird called from the pines. The horses in the near pasture shifted and grazed. The light continued its slow, golden progression across the frost. I have been thinking, Ada said carefully, about what comes next. She looked at the fence line, at the repaired section, at the long run of rail extending in both directions into the valley. I have a life, back east, work, a room I rented by the month. She looked back at him. None of those things feel, at this particular moment, like sufficient reasons to leave. Callum said nothing immediately, but something moved through his face. That same movement she had seen by firelight in the front room, the loosening of the long-held arrangement of control, the thing beneath it coming through not as weakness, but as its opposite, as something that had been maintained under great pressure for a long time and was finally, with permission, being set down. I have been thinking too, he said. His voice was low and very steady. About the second cup of coffee. He paused. I have been setting it out every morning since you arrived. I told myself it was habit, that it didn't mean anything. He looked at her directly. It meant something. Ada felt something in her chest open, the way a window opens. Not dramatically, not with force. Just the simple movement of a thing that has been closed against the weather for a long time, finally being turned on its hinge by a hand that knows how. I know, she said. They stood on either side of the fence in the early spring morning and looked at each other, and in that looking was everything that had accumulated between them. The careful days, the kitchen table conversations, the fire, the journal, the barn in the dark, the weight of shared truth and shared silence, the slow and patient work of two people learning, in the particular way that only time and attention make possible, to trust the same world at the same time. Callum opened the gate in the fence section. He didn't make a gesture of it. He simply opened it, the way you open something you want someone to be able to walk through. Ada walked through. Later, Ruth came to call. She came most weeks now, arriving in her wagon with the easy regularity of someone who had decided that a thing was worth continuing and required no further justification. And she found them in the kitchen garden along the south wall of the house. Ada was on her knees in the dark earth, pressing seeds in at careful intervals. Callum was beside her, not gardening but present, seated on the low stone border of the bed, watching the valley. Ruth stood at the edge of the garden for a moment, taking in the arrangement of them, the proximity, the ease, the absence of the careful distance that had characterized the early weeks. She did not say anything about it. She simply went to the porch and sat in the chair she had come to think of as hers and called out that she had brought bread and that someone should put the kettle on when they were ready. Ada sat back on her heels and looked at what she had planted. The bed ran the full length of the south wall, the dark earth turned and ready, the seeds invisible now, present only as future. She thought of her mother's hands in a garden on the eastern land, and of her own hands in the soil, and of the particular persistence of things that grow in difficult ground. Callum stood and brushed the dust from his coat. He extended a hand down to her, not because she needed help rising, but in the simple, undemonstrative way of a person who has decided to offer what they have and leave the taking to someone else. Ada took his hand and stood. They walked together toward the porch, toward Ruth and the kettle and the ordinary warmth of the afternoon, and the valley spread out around them in the long spring light, enormous and patient and indifferent in the beautiful way of things that have been here much longer than the people moving through them and will remain long after. The high grass beginning to green at the roots, the pines holding their dark steadiness on the ridge, the creek running with the snowmelt, the water moving through the eastern land that was now, finally and correctly, where it belonged. In the barn, June stood in her clean stall with the fresh hay and the lamp burning on its post. Her water bucket was full. The nameplate on her door had been repainted that week, not by Callum, who had always done it before, but by Ada, who had asked for the paint and the brush, and had spent an afternoon on it, working with the same careful attention she brought to every act of repair. The letters were clear and even and new, and they would hold against the weather for a long time. On the kitchen shelf, beside Callum's coffee tin and the jar of dried herbs, 2 cups stood where 2 cups had always stood. They were the same cups as before. Nothing about them had changed. But in the morning, for the first time in longer than Callum Shaw could clearly remember, neither one of them would be emptied and put away untouched. Outside, the wind came back with the evening, gentle this time, moving through the valley from the west, bending the new grass in long, slow waves, carrying the smell of pine and cold stone, and the particular freshness of a season that has finally, after a long and difficult wait, agreed to begin. The cedar tree at the gate bent the way it always did, permanently westward, leaning toward something it had been reaching for all its life. But in the new light of the late afternoon, at a certain angle, it did not look like a tree straining against the wind. It looked like a tree that had found its direction and was simply, steadily, growing in it. There were things Ada had not expected when she stepped off the conveyance that had carried her west. She had not expected the particular quality of silence that lived in this valley, not the absence of sound, but a presence of its own, something that had weight and texture, and that she had come, over the weeks, to find necessary in the way that certain things become necessary slowly, without announcement. She had not expected the way the light changed with the seasons here, or the way the cold had a different character than eastern cold. Cleaner, sharper, without the damp that made eastern winters feel like something pressing against you from outside. She had not expected June, who turned out to be the most straightforward creature on the property and the easiest to be with in the early morning when everything else required navigation. And she had not expected Callum Shaw. Not the man she had imagined from the letter's brief mention of him, not the guardian figure, the keeper of secrets, the representative of everything that had been done to her family. She had expected someone to receive information from and to leave. Instead, she had found a man who sat on the floor of a horse stall in the dark because it helped him, who repaired things that no one else would notice were broken, who had carried a weight for years that was not his to carry, and had not once put it down or asked for acknowledgement of the effort. She had found, in other words, someone who understood repair not as a transaction, but as a practice, as a way of being in the world. It was Ruth who said it plainly. One afternoon when she and Ada were sitting on the porch, while Callum worked the fence line in the distance, his figure small against the enormous backdrop of the valley. Ruth had been watching him with the affectionate, clear-eyed attention of someone who has known a person long enough to see them accurately. He has been waiting for something to tend to, Ruth said. Not a project, not a task, something that tends back. Ada had looked at the figure at the fence line, at the deliberate, unhurried way he moved through the work. How long? She asked. A long time, Ruth said simply. Long enough that he stopped expecting it. Ada thought about the 2 cups, about the railing on the porch, repaired to a standard that no one would require of a man who lived alone, about the window pane filled carefully with something clear and resinous, done with the care of someone who was not making repairs for utility, but for the principle of the thing. The principle that what was cracked should be made whole, that what was damaged should be tended to, that a house ought to be kept as though it mattered whether it was kept. She understood that she had been doing the same thing, in her way, for most of her life. Working in other people's houses, mending other people's things, putting her hands to the work of repair without ever having a place that was hers to repair, without ever having been in a position to work towards something rather than simply through it. This, she thought, watching Callum set a post back into the frozen ground with the patient, methodical effort of someone who has learned that good work is mostly just continued work. This might be what it felt like. To work towards something. To stay. The journal was on the shelf in the bedroom she had come to think of simply as her room, without the qualifier of guest or temporary or borrowed. She had read it many times now and knew it in the way you know something that has become part of how you understand yourself. Not as external information, but as something metabolized, taken in, and transformed into a different kind of knowing. Her mother's words were in her now. The particular way that woman had observed the world, the dry precision of her wit, the tenderness she had not known how to express directly, and had expressed instead through careful attention to small things. All of it was part of Ada now, woven in alongside the things she had known about herself before she arrived. She was not the same person who had stood in the cemetery at the beginning of winter, pressing 2 fingers to the cold granite of a stranger's stone. She was not sure she could have said precisely what was different, except that the question she had been carrying for most of her life, the question of why, of what it meant that she had been left, of whether she had been worth staying for, had not been answered so much as it had been set down. Not resolved, set down. There was a difference. The question remained what it was, a wound, an old one, the kind that does not disappear but scar over and become part of the landscape of a person. But she had set it down, and her hands were free now for other things, and the difference between carrying something and setting it down turned out to be larger than she had understood when the carrying was all she knew. Spring deepened around the ranch with the unhurried confidence of a season that knows it has time. The kitchen garden along the south wall began to show the first pale suggestion of green along the rows where Ada had pressed seeds into the dark earth. Callum watched the progress of it each morning when he came around the corner of the house from the barn. She noticed this without mentioning it, the way she noticed most things, quietly and with attention, adding it to the running account she kept of the ways this man demonstrated care without saying so. One morning she came out to find that he had built a low fence around the bed, not because it needed one, but because the draft horses had a habit of drifting toward the south wall, and a fence was the kind of thing that prevented small problems before they became larger ones. He had used the leftover timber from the porch repair, so the fence matched the railing in color and grain. She stood looking at it for a long moment, and he came around the corner and saw her looking and said nothing. And she said nothing. And they went inside together for coffee in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have run out of things to prove to each other. The stone in the cemetery she had visited at the start was not her mother's stone. She understood that now, understood whose it was and what it meant that Callum had kept it clean, had scraped the moss from the letters with careful hands, and kept the grave as tended as June's stall. It was a form of loyalty, she thought, not to the person who had died. She was not certain, even now, how much of what Callum felt about that particular loss was grief, and how much was something more complicated. But to the fact of the loss itself, to the acknowledgement that something had been present and was now gone, and that this mattered and ought to be marked. She visited the grave herself one morning in early spring. She did not bring flowers, because the ground was still too cold for anything to be growing. She brought instead a smooth river stone she had found along the creek bank, the same kind of stone her mother had carried in the wooden box, the kind people carry for comfort, worn smooth by water and time. She set it at the base of the headstone, pressed into the soft ground with both thumbs, and stood for a moment in the cold morning air with the cedar tree bent above her and the valley spread out below. She did not speak aloud. She did not know what she would have said, but she stayed for a while, present in the way that presence sometimes matters more than words, and then she went back down the hill the way she had come, and the wind followed her, gentle now, the way it was gentle in spring, and she walked back through the gate that Callum had opened and across the yard toward the house where 2 cups of coffee were waiting on the table, side by side, neither of them empty.